started. So this is our last session. The format for this is going to be slightly different. We're going to have open questions afterwards, so there'll be two mics moving around after the presentations and a little bit of discussion on stage. So I'll do my introductions. So Tom Yarnall, executive editor for the Treasury of Buddhist Science series of translations of works from the Tibetan Tenjur and associated literature, being co-published by the American Institute of Buddhist Studies, Columbia Center for Buddhist Studies, and Tibet House US, and being distributed by Columbia University Press. He will speak to us about the process of editing, so often elided and yet so vital in book production. Emily Bauer is a teacher and editor with over 10 years' experience in publishing. She has worked for Shambhala, Wisdom, 84,000, as well as Dharma Spring Bookstore. She will speak about the importance of the translator's introduction, that little section where the translator has to speak in her own voice. So John Canti, unfortunately, is not able to be here. Casey Kemp from Shambhala Publications is so graciously going to sit in. We're going to have a video that John made to speak, and then Casey will be able to field some questions. Casey, she has a master's in Tibetan Buddhist philosophy and is working on her dissertation in Vienna with Tom Tillemans, and has worked closely with the Drigung Kagyu monastic community in Europe.
No.
But she has trained for 84,000 under Tom Tillemans, right?
As well as John Canti.
And John Canti. Yeah. All right. So I got, yeah. All right. Sorry. She's translated and edited for 84,000 and works as an editor of Shambhala Publications. Let's see if I can get this one right. David Kittelstrom is a senior editor at Wisdom Publications, where he supervises many of their academic and translation series. As an editor, he helps translators in their decision points, helping them ask the critical questions that he will survey with us today. So, okay, please.
So I'll just give you a quick introduction into the process of how this panel came about. Once it was decided there would be a panel on the editorial process, the four of us who were involved at the time, which was myself, Emily, David, and John Canti, were fortunate enough to coordinate our schedules from France, California, and New York to get online together and have a Skype session. And during that 2-hour Skype session, we had a Google Doc, so I typed up notes, and we could all see what was being typed up and agree that what the ideas that were being captured were what we were saying and thinking. There was an amazing amount, a number of seed questions, and then quite a lot of themes came out of that conversation. An amazing amount of confluence of ideas came out of that particular session, and we agreed we needed to have another one. A few weeks later, we had a second 2-hour thing, revised the various points and refined further, and then we actually had a third one. So quite a lot of ideas got discussed. It was kind of all over the map, but fortunately it was captured in this Google Doc. The reason I mention this is because in terms of presenting this here, we thought it would probably be helpful to take all those ideas and consolidate them and sort of organize them in some way. So that's why I have a PowerPoint ready to show here, which hopefully I can keep to under 10 minutes. It'll be the only PowerPoint today. The rest will be conversations elaborating on these points. So my PowerPoint is going to show you the distilled essence of kind of what we discussed in certain topic areas. And then once we found out that John Canti wasn't going to be able to make it, he was able to make this video, and then we were fortunate when we got here to the conference to have another 2-hour meeting at dinner to include Casey. So we've had quite a few conversations and a lot of confluence and some differences of ideas. So the topics and themes, the many topics and themes that we discussed seem to fall into these 5 categories, more or less. In the very beginning, and just in a minute, I'll talk about types of editing, because exactly what the word editing means is sometimes confusing. The process and the timing of editing is a major topic we discussed. The view of the editor-publisher. I'll also be discussing a little bit about the difference between translating, editing, and publishing. So that's the next topic. And what's the difference between those terms and how do they relate? Editing is integral to the translation transmission process. That'll actually be a topic that was sort of one of my pet interests, so I'll be elaborating on that in our second round. So those are our 5 major topics. So in terms of types of editors and editing, this is my only slide with tiny text. Most of it won't be this tiny, but I'll just put this up here. I think it's useful. This is actually from the Chicago Manual of Style. There's the editor-in-chief or acquisitions editor is an important type of editing that takes place. We won't be saying a lot about that. Some others have spoken to that previously. But obviously the editor-in-chief and acquisitions editors of any publishing enterprise have the overview picture of what's the vision of what's being published here, and is a certain type of publication appropriate and so forth, or how might need to be changed to be appropriate. What I'll be discussing mostly in the next minute is maybe what we could call editing in the trenches, which includes what's called copy editing, mechanical editing, substantive editing, and developmental editing. Again, these are categories as defined in the Chicago Manual of Style. We each looked at these and agreed that there were a lot of overlaps, and we didn't necessarily agree with all of these definitions. But copy editing and mechanical editing kind of go together as one set. I won't read this all out loud right now. But it's oftentimes what people think of as editing. When they're a translator, they turn into translation. They think now their work will be copy edited and published. But I think it's become pretty clear throughout this conference that what publishers usually do is quite a lot more than that. It's quite a sustained process, usually involving these other two categories of editing, which can be broken down into what's called substantive editing or developmental editing. Those I'll read briefly. Deals with the organization and presentation of content, rewriting to improve style or eliminate ambiguity, reorganizing or tightening, recasting tables, and so forth. Developmental editing is a little bit more involved, more directly shapes the content of the work, the way the material should be presented, the need for more or less documentation, and so forth. And all of these types of editing are types of editing that all of us do in our role as editors and publishers. So we can unpack any of that if necessary as we go on. So the first main topic that a lot of us sort of agreed on, it had to do with both the process and the timing of editing. Number one, that editing is very labor intensive, as has come out in quite a few presentations already. And we came up with this kind of idea of sort of creation stages and perfection stages in the process of editing. The creation stage, I would argue, actually is something that takes place ongoingly from the beginning of the translation process and throughout. It's oftentimes what we think of as retranslating or polishing. So from the first time you come up with a rough translation of the first paragraph of your Tibetan text in your cave, and you immediately see there's something wrong and you tweak it, I mean, you're already obviously involved in the process of editing. And this goes on, this is a theme I'll bring up later, but the idea that editing is something integral to translation, and it takes place throughout the entire translation process. So if we want to sort of provisionally divide things into creation and perfection stages, I would say the creation stage ideally occurs with a separate editor, a colleague or a publisher. So for example, in our opening discussion between Jimpa and Don Lopez, they discussed this marvelous process they had where they were sort of going back and forth as two co-translators working and going from liberal to literal and so forth. So that's an editing process that's occurring right from the beginning and what we could call the creation stages. That could also happen with a publisher, actually, and ideally in an ideal world that would happen. And that's as opposed to what we could call the translator in the cave model, where you're in your cave all by yourself with your text for 2 years, and then you come out with a semi-finished product and then start having it revised and edited by someone else. Not an optimal way to progress. Creation stages then also, once the publisher's editors are involved, then I would say this is still part of the creation stage. We're not really ready to call it complete yet. A point that came up that I was surprised, because this is something I was thinking, but then John Canti actually, in a conversation in New York and then subsequently in the Skype session, agreed that final manuscript, what we might call final manuscript that is submitted to the publisher. Let's say when a manuscript is typically submitted to a publisher, and oftentimes in the eyes of the translator, it's almost ready to go with a few tweaks. In his experience, in our experience as well, it's oftentimes about, realistically, on average, 50% complete, both in terms of what the final product will be, and therefore work with the publisher from that point onwards in terms of formatting, all types of editing that we just discussed a minute ago, and finally publishing. Usually takes about half the time, so about half the way there and half the cost. And this can typically take another year or two. It varies a lot from project to project, but this is sort of on average, just to sort of set a different sort of expectation perhaps. What we might call the perfection stages then do not begin as soon as the manuscript has been submitted, like I said. Perfection stages generally we could say is what's taking place in the final stages of editing and publishing. And a point that quite a number of us brought up is that the final 5% of editing often takes a disproportionate amount of time and effort, but can make some of the biggest difference in terms of readability and accessibility. Okay, so moving on to the briefly to the topic of the view of the editor-publisher, which some of our panelists will be unpacking further. Publishers do need to communicate the editorial view to the translators. Ideally, this should occur early on. Too often this occurs too late, which then requires quite a lot of revision. So the sooner you can be in communication with even a prospective publisher, the better, working with their editors. Different publishers, 84,000, the IBS, Wisdom, Shambhala, Tibetan Classics, academic publishers, generally are going to want a degree of consistency across their publications or within a project or series. Hence, you're going to save a lot of time and get your book published much more quickly if you have these conversations early on in the process. John pointed out that it's important to emphasize this is not just a set of rules that you're expected to adhere to, but to actually try to understand a coherent explanation of the reasons behind a particular set of policies, which may be adaptable over time or may be adaptable to a particular text or genre. And the editorial view is the driver of the publisher's product. So for example, the choice of style, whether it's technical, academic, or for practitioners, lay people, etc., that view will change the way, the editor's view will change how that looks. Understanding who the reader is, that's where translating and editing should start and finish. So the third major topic, it was the topic of publishing and how is publishing actually a little bit of a different category than editing and translating. And in my own comments a little bit later today, I'm going to actually try to break down somewhat the boundary between translating and editing. I see those as sort of one coherent thing. Publishing is, in a way, a distinct thing. Why? Because edited translations per se may be very polished and they may be very complete and wonderful. They may have introductions, annotations, and so forth. But then if they're simply uploaded online as a PDF or something, or made publicly available in some other way, that's not quite the same as publishing. Translations that are published entail much more, usually often including, hopefully, better editing and production, greater availability, greater stability and shelf life, and a different type or quality of transmission, I would argue. And just to unpack those really quickly, better editing and production, why? Because they're peer-reviewed. Often better scholarship is expected and produced. They're therefore more robust. Comprehensive editing occurs, as discussed above. You have a team of editors now working to help perfect the final product. And this oftentimes, hopefully, results in a higher quality text that's now published. It has better readability, it's more accessible, and so forth. So that was point one of the four. Greater availability. Distribution is very important, marketing and advertising. So this is all as opposed to just taking your finished translation, uploading it online. You get bibliographic information accessible universally via online databases, Library of Congress, MARC, Boker, Amazon, and so forth. ISBNs are made available. Greater stability and shelf life. I think this is one of the more important points. A published text, a hard copy book, or an ebook, is actually more stable or permanent than a text that could be constantly uploaded and downloaded and changed. It might be lost online. It's also easier to cite. I think that's very important. You can cite a particular book, a particular year, a particular page number. Again, a text that's just uploaded online, you can't do that with. Published translations also, I would say, affect, therefore, a different type and a different quality of transmission. So all of the above topics that we just mentioned significantly impact the type, quality, depth, durability, and so forth of the transmission of the text. So again, these are points we discussed. I'd be happy in a conversation. We'd be happy to elaborate on this further. For right now, I'm just sort of putting that out there as a conclusion. So what is transmitted is actually different. A book and what would purport to be the same translation as an electronic text that's uploaded does actually affect a very different kind of transmission. So my own topic that I'm going to expand on a little bit later has to do with the idea that editing is integral to translation and transmission. Editing is not something that's different than translating. It's actually part of the process. You almost need a hyphenated word, translating, editing. So the translation, I'm also going to want to argue, includes the entire published work. All aspects and qualities of the work affect how the translated work is understood, that is the meaning of the translation, how it's felt, and how it's received or transmitted. All aspects and qualities, and likewise all parts, and I'll be expanding on that later, likewise have an impact on the transmission of the work. Okay, so that's the brief overview of the topics we discussed, and now we can unpack further.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I wanted to say a bit about some of the specific elements of a book beyond just the core translation. And it's helpful, I think, to think about these before you approach a publisher or an editor. It's helpful to think about these things as you go. So obviously, one of the things that you've probably been creating as you translate the text is endnotes. And one of my favorite subheadings in this book that I'm going to talk about, the Chicago Manual of Style, is remedies for excessive annotation. Footnotes versus endnotes. Commentary and quotations in notes. Shortened citations. So I'm kind of joking around, but this is actually an extremely valuable resource that all book publishers in the United States and generally Canada use. And if you've never heard of it, I would suggest that you take a really good look and become familiar with it, even if you're not actually translating a text that's going to be published as a book. It's a really wonderful resource for writers and editors and anybody who's looking to create something that someone else is going to read. And I wanted to share, because this book is being celebrated in particular this weekend, I thought I'd use this as an example, The Just King. And I think our translator authors may be in the room. Jose?
Oh, there he is.
So I thought this is something that's out on the table, Shambhala Publications table, that you might want to take a look at. But it's a really good example of a translation with excellent, very helpful apparatus. The table of contents is, I don't know if you can't really see it, it's succinct, unlike some tables of contents that you might have seen before that are associated or connected with a translated work. Sometimes, it feels like it's an outline. It can be really detailed. So this one is streamlined and simple. It's readable. Most of the chapter titles are one line. So these are just simple elements to think about in making your project accessible and even juicy, interesting to your reader. The introduction is a very reasonable length. Maybe unlike most people, I tend to go first to the introduction in a work like this, a scholarly work or a work that I know is going to be meaty and dharmic content. I go straight to the introduction because if I can't understand the introduction or if it doesn't have information for me about what's in the book, then I generally tend not to buy that book. Maybe you know how that feels when you're trying to decide what's in this book, how can I evaluate its value for me. That's what you can start to think about as you're working on the translation. What is most important for me to share with a general reader, say, to help them into this work? And I would suggest that for me anyway, it's helpful to think about that as I'm editing the work, in your case, as you're creating the work, instead of trying to do it all at the end after you've finished. Because as you go, you come across the jewels and the sparkling bits that you want to highlight or mention, or the reasons why this particular text really draws you, held your attention throughout, etc. Table of contents, the front matter. And in general, in addition to just the parts of the book, there are a lot of really helpful tips about how writers can make their project more appealing. And the publisher or let's just say publisher, in whatever form that turns out to be for your translation, is going to encourage you to not compromise, never, but to think about and try and rework your project so that it's most readable and most appealing to your colleagues and even to a lay reader. So it's really helpful to you, I think, psychologically, if you already know that, before you start to feel hurt or insulted or maybe compromised in your integrity or your career by some editor who says, sorry, that's just way too long, or this bit was really boring and I couldn't really understand what you were saying. Nobody would ever say anything so rude. You want to be able to be prepared, I guess is what I'm saying, and feel that you know what to expect when your baby, your 10-year translation project is actually ready to be shared with the public, who are actually going to be putting out some money to pay for it. I think I'll stop there for now.
Okay.
I had some prepared comments, but stuff that Emily is saying is sort of making some popcorn stuff in my head. I mean, just
Do you want to hold this?
no, as a publisher, as an editor for a publisher, you have an awareness that you have your potential readers, because they're, everyone's a potential reader. You have their attention, when they're deciding what they're going to pick up and look at and read for a very short amount of time. And people make very quick judgments about what is in a book based on, quite superficial things. But these things that maybe seem kind of, last minute think of, and, they're quite superficial, they're vital in terms of, the overall reception of your book. And, even in the readers, the translation inside actually might not be that different from what you submit. It might be quite, almost the same, just with a few tweaks here and there. But, if it has a bad title, if it has a really busy table of contents, if the headings are really wordy and the layout's not that great, and there's all kinds of just micro decisions. Like when you're translating, you're making, as Curtis was saying, you're making lots and lots of decisions. There's editors are also making lots and lots of decisions. A nip here, a tuck here, to help sort of bring out the beauty of the translation and not give the reader, potential reader, a reason to disregard your text, because they don't need much. They really don't need much to sort of, give it one thought and then not go back to it. Unless their llama said, oh, you must read this book, then, it doesn't matter what it looks like, they're going to put the time in. But, most of the time that's not the case. So, it's so important to have an editor to help you see the book, with the eyes of the reader, and think about those things. And also style. I think style, we take for granted in publishing that people understand what style is. But before I got into publishing, someone said style, it just meant like, my style, my writing style. But style is a very particular thing, and it's what editors train in, So a lay understanding of editing might involve, it's making the language more pretty and it's getting rid of typos, which is part of what we do as editors, for sure, but a lot of what we're doing is paying attention to things that are not wrong in and of themselves, but are only wrong in relation to the rest of the book, or in relation to the publisher's standard operating procedure, or in relation to who you're trying to reach as an audience. So things can be not technically wrong, but things are wrong in relation to these relative things. And so what an editor does is they're helping you make style choices based on your target reader and, the Chicago Manual, of course, and the Publisher's Style Guide. And then not only make it, if it comes up on page 52, they're trained to pay attention to certain kinds of things that are relatively superficial, such that every time they see them, they notice them. So a trained editor, the difference between a trained editor and an untrained editor is an untrained editor might recognize these things or problems or notice them, but they don't notice them. They don't notice them every time they come up in a book. You want someone who is not going to just edit half the occurrences of something in a book. You want them to find all the occurrences in a book. And obviously, with modern technology, these things are becoming. There are a lot of technical strategies you can use to do that, but you have to sort of notice it in the first place. How much time have I been talking so
Another
far?
5 minutes.
Okay, good. I could say, when Luis was talking about the polysemic range, or the polysemic terms in a text, copy editors like consistency. They like things to be the same every time. There's, a good copy editors tend to be a little on the autism spectrum, I think, because you like things to be sort of correct, But if you're too far down that causes problems as well, because you have to take the project on its own terms. You have to sort of respond to the internal logic of the text and also the translator or the author's personal style. And not just sort of go barging in with how, your own particular ideas. So it's good, I think. Susan said earlier, she says, maybe this is just a paraphrase, in the liminal zone of translation, expertise can be a liability. So what I found in this conference is so fascinating for me, because translators, like editors, like translators, are occupying this same, what in Tibetan we'd call a bardo, between the source text and the reader. But we sort of occupy a somewhat different place. And whereas Curtis was talking about the 4 different kinds of things that translators pay attention to, I'm going to miss the 4th one, but it's form, feeling, content, and figures. Okay. And whereas the translators are paying more attention to the content, I think editors are, are looking at form and feeling and the reader experience of it, and so we bring that to it. So, but what was I going to say? But it's it's a lot of things that apply to translators also apply to editors. But whereas the translators have to know, as editors, we also have to understand the text. I mean, that's how we edit, is, when we read it, we're having to pay attention to, does it make sense? To us as readers, there's also physical cues, like if I'm getting really tired, or if I'm, reading something and I'm just have this strong urge to get up and go get a sandwich or something. This is telling me that I'm having to work really hard in order to get what this text is trying to tell me. And so these are the kinds of places that we pay attention to when we're editing. And so, but the point I was going to say about expertise is that, when we approach a text, it's important to not have an agenda and not sort of be clinging too hard to your own ideas. You want to sort of, when you enter a text, sort of enter it and take it on its own terms. But knowledge in itself for an editor is not a problem. More knowledge is a better thing, because then you can spot more issues. It's been one of the factors of having been doing this for 20 years or so, is that, you have a sort of accumulated number of things that you're primed to see or notice. So one of the biggest downfalls, I think, of an editor is having is not knowing your place, sort of not respecting the authorial voice, and having a little knowledge with a big ego. for an editor to go in there, this just infuriates authors and translators, to have someone going in there who doesn't realize what they don't know, and starts changing things that don't need to be changed. Editing is as much knowing what needs to be addressed as it is knowing when it doesn't need to be addressed. Stepping back and saying, actually, this is, it reads fine. There's nothing worse than coming across an edit where the editor has made it read worse than it was to begin with, and so that's a pitfall. I think you want an editor who doesn't do that. One more thing, I guess. I was going to say about the polysemic range. I didn't really get to that. The knowledge is helpful when like you're trying to differentiate between an inconsistency and as an editor and something that is just a different meaning of the same word. If you don't know enough, you'll just sort of go in and just apply the same term every single time it appears. But I was thinking of this in relation to a book, a manuscript that is going through the pipeline right now for us, and the word, the term pramana comes up a lot in this particular text, and I went through and did a search and found all these choices for rendering the word pramana. So it had pramana, untranslated, epistemology, authentic knowledge, valid cognition, epistemological discourses, means of knowledge, valid means of knowledge, means of cognition, means of valid knowledge, and means of valid cognition. So, there are obviously, with a word like pramana, which has a semantic range, sometimes you're talking about a curriculum subject in the monastery. Sometimes you're talking about a consciousness. Sometimes you're talking about generally sort of logic and epistemology. And so you need to be able to differentiate, when is a valid, different use of the word, of the term, but when is just a needless, pointless inconsistency, and sort of be able to go in there and root those things out. So much.
I'm going to cut you off soon.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, I said that. Susan also said that readers have to trust the translator's capacity to access the source text. And in that, the editor can be a great ally for you, because there's nothing will turn off readers to dismiss you more quickly than to have someone find this really glaring error, in something. So, typos, obviously missing diacritics. These kinds of things can really erode a reader's confidence in your capacity, even though they're superficial. You might have perfectly understood the subject, but people make superficial judgments all the time, sort of unconsciously. And an editor can be a great ally in sort of helping you put your best foot forward and reach your reader most effectively. So I'll stop there.
So I'm very honored to be here on this panel with such experienced and knowledgeable editors, especially since I don't really have to say anything. So that's great. So I just want to briefly introduce John Canti, who I'm sure all of you know, but just in case. John Canti is a very important and vital member of our Tibetan Buddhist translation community. He is on the steering committee for the Tsadra conference. He has worked for many years for the Tsadra Foundation, has translated many important works. He's the president and co-founder of the Padmakara Translation Group. He is the editorial director of the 84,000 Translation Group, and he is an experienced and prolific translator and editor. And I've been lucky to have been able to work under his supervision for copy editing for 84,000. So. And while his presence of this conference is sorely missed, we're lucky enough to have this video where he can give us his thoughts on the editorial process.
Hello everyone. I'm so sorry not to be there in person. Over the last few months, David, Emily, Tom and I have had some very interesting conversations on the editorial process on Skype in preparation for this conference. I would so like to be there to be able to continue the conversation in the presence of everybody there. The idea of this conference has really been to stimulate exchange and conversation and not just have static presentations. But here I am, unfortunately unable to do anything else but give you this one-way video talk. So I'm really sorry about that, but there wasn't much I could do. So at the very least I'll try and keep it short and jump in straight away with a couple of the main points that I would really like to put across. The first is the importance of the very last 5% of editing. One of the best ways of being kind to the reader is to make sure that there's nothing stands in the way of him or her taking in what you as a translator or author have to say on your topic, or what the original author of your translated work was trying to put across. And although you may have done all kinds of incredible work to decipher and understand and disentangle and present a particular translated work, a very small number of quite superficial things can completely put off a reader from paying proper attention. And this is something I think that's been well known to publishers for a long time and is perhaps less appreciated by authors and translators who contribute their work. I'd like to show you this, an example of a book. This is Etienne Lamotte's translation and introduction to the Vimalakirti Sutra, published in Belgium in 1962. It's a beautifully produced book. It's aging a bit now. It has all kinds of incredibly complicated notes, typefaces to show the different source texts, bibliographies, references, different languages, brings in Sanskrit and Tibetan, of course. There's some beautifully hand calligraphed Chinese done by one of, presumably one of Lamotte's students. And it's an extraordinary piece of work, but probably quite representative of really high quality publishing, where they had, people doing the copy editing, the typesetting, the layout, the taking care of all the consistency and all the tiny little issues that make so much difference. And it really shows. You really feel when you have a book like this in your hands that you're completely confident that so many people have taken care to make sure that it really is what it says and that it does what it's supposed to do. And the effect is extraordinary. Nowadays, of course, we're very lucky to have both Wisdom and Shambhala, and as well as many of the university presses, as highly professional publishers of Buddhist texts. From what I understand, it's getting more and more difficult to finance and make sure that all of the professions that go into making a really good book still contribute and can be brought to bear on the work. So far, I'm impressed by the quality that we see. But nowadays, with a lot of self-publishing, internet publications, PDFs circulating everywhere, it's so easy for those standards to drop, and it really shows. There are, a few things that can really put you off a book. I'd like to bring up one example, which is, I want to make very clear, is not a criticism of the work itself. This is a book that was published a few years ago, Bhutan's History of Buddhism, translated by Lisa Stein and Ngawan Zampo, who's a very old friend and a remarkable translator. when I first saw this book, I looked through it a bit, and I realized that there were plenty of good things about it, but the names, the titles of all of the Tibetan and Sanskrit works that were mentioned in it had been translated into English, and there was no table in the back, there was no bibliography which told you what the original titles were of those translated names. And for me, that was it. You know, this is Bhutan's history, incredibly interesting thing. It's really not something that you would settle down to read at night to amuse yourself. It's a reference work. And if it doesn't have those correspondences that you need in order to be able to use it, to find something that you're looking for, to understand the context of something that, some text that you've been researching, then it's not much use. Now, in all fairness to Ngawang, he explains that this is supposed to be a kind of retranslation of Obermüller's original translation in English done in the last century. And of course one could read it along with Obermüller's translation and find the names. It's not impossible, but it's just, you know, for me this just kind of, I wrote it off. And recently I picked it up again to have a closer look, and I found many, many good things in the book. I think the translation is really good. There's Ngawang has put in some remarkable accounts of Bhutan's life and his importance, and there's a lot about sectarianism and some very, very interesting thoughts that he's put into the book. And I actually, now I can say that I thoroughly recommend it. But I think that absence of one editorial element spoilt it for me and prevented me from taking it in properly. And to me that's a very important lesson. Another example from the world of kind of Dharma Center translations. I've got here a text that happened to come my way recently. It's a teaching by Chogyal Pakpa. It's actually a letter that he wrote, and it's been translated to be taught in Dharma centers in the Sakya tradition. And it's called Gelbu Jibik Temurla Tam Tu Jawa Norbu Trengwa. And the English translation that's been done has called it Chogyal Pakpa's Advice, A Garland of Jewels. So, first of all, A Garland of Jewels, we're rather tired of hearing those kind of titles, but that's perhaps an aside. That's a side issue. But it seems to me that what's missing from the title is the most important part, which is that this was a talk given or a letter written to Gelbu Jibik Temur. So, of course, I'm not an expert on the history of the Sakya lineage, but probably most of you know that Chogyal Pakpa was, following Sakya Pandita, was extremely involved with the Mongol court. And this is a letter that he wrote to a prince. I don't actually know who he was. I believe that Chogyal Pakpa's main patron, who was Kublai Khan, had a son called Temur and a grandson as well, and I'm not quite sure which one it is. That's probably irrelevant. But basically, this was Chogyal Pakpa writing to somebody in the royal family with a huge amount of power, very wealthy, as he mentions in the text, and probably a strong tendency to extreme ferocity. And so what Chogyal Pakpa has to say to him to try and mitigate some of the worst things that this guy might do in the future when he grows up is obviously very interesting indeed. And for it to be missing from the title, and perhaps in the context of an oral teaching, all of this would have been explained. But it seems to me, again, this fundamental importance of contextualizing a text, explaining where it comes from, what its history is, what it was for, who it was destined for, and why it is as it is, it enhances so much for the reader's experience, and it's almost criminal to leave it out. So these are just a couple of small and almost random examples of the kinds of things that can go wrong with a translation that's published. And of course, most translators will want to avoid them and are entirely capable of avoiding them themselves. What an editor does isn't really that different from what a translator does. But an editor, whether it's a copy editor or a publishing editor or an editor who's part of the translation team, can come with a fresh eye and notice things that the translator has perhaps missed. In some ways, you know, of course we owe it to our readers to maximize the intelligence and the contextual information and everything with which we present the works that we're proposing to them, publishing to them. Seen from another way round, if we're really talking about the transmission of Dharma in the West, if we don't present our work intelligently, then we may not get the intelligent readers we would like. Now, it would probably be a little bit megalomaniac to suggest that the readership profile of Dharma books is something that's going to influence the way Dharma is transmitted in the West. But there is an element of that. And I think it's so important that we don't end up with situations like, I believe, somewhere in the US there's a dinosaur museum which is dedicated to proving that the Earth is only 6,000 years old and that dinosaurs were contemporary with humans. So I think we're not quite in that league yet anyway. So finally, I'd like to put in a plea for the commissioning editor, or publishing editor. In other words, somebody with a wide experience, perhaps in translating, perhaps in research, perhaps in history, or perhaps in a more traditional Dharma setting, who can take a wide perspective on the publication of particular bodies of literature and add the fruit of their experience and knowledge to a work that's been published. We tend to be a little bit individualistic in our desire to publish and be known as translators and to produce a work. I think it's very, very important to see how teams can be developed and how collaboration can work to contribute to the quality of some of the Dharma books that we produce. So I'm going to end there, not take up too much of your time, and wish you a very interesting discussion on the editorial process. And once again, I'm so sorry not to be present to be able to take part fully.
Are you doing a presentation?
Yeah, I'll cycle back here.
Okay.
So I had a couple of, before I move back into some sort of meta level, maybe theoretical comments, just to finish off with my thoughts. I had a couple of popcorn moments as well, based on what David was saying, and a bit about what John was saying that I just want to articulate, and that has to do with this issue of consistency, and I know that can make some people nervous. I think you addressed that pretty nicely, but just to unpack that a little bit further, there's two kinds of inconsistency that we encounter as editors when we get manuscripts. One is an inconsistency that anyone would obviously want ironed out, like the word Nagarjuna, if it's a Tengur text, they're oftentimes cross-referencing many texts, so many names of Sanskrit authors and texts come up. So if Mula Madhyamaka Karaka appears 50 times or Nagarjuna appears 50 times, and there's a diacritic missing here or there, that's an inconsistency you would want us to catch. And so actually one thing we do, that I do as an editor, and I would encourage you to do it because it would actually accelerate the whole process, is when I get a manuscript in, I will immediately search and replace the word Nagarjuna with what's called a character style. If you're not familiar with that in Microsoft Word, I recommend you learn. All it does is it applies a particular style. And the style is simply called cited author, and it makes the text green. By searching and replacing that, all the Nagarjunas throughout the entire text turn green. I do the same thing with text. I have a character style called cited texts. It turns everything that, if Mula Madhyamaka Karaka appears once, the first time I see it, I do a search and replace. It makes all Mula Madhyamaka Karakas italic blue. And they stay green and blue throughout the editorial process to the end, and obviously when we go to print, we simply change the style back to being black. Why do I do this? Because when we're going through the editorial process now, if I suddenly see a Nagarjuna that's not green, I know there's something misspelled. Or if I see a Mula Madhyamaka Karaka that's not blue, I know there's a typo there. And it's easy for the eye to miss that. And you would be surprised, perhaps, there's not a single manuscript we have received where there aren't quite a few errors like that. And this is by translators I consider to be extremely competent, extremely meticulous, and yet this occurs all the time. So this is something I do just to fix all the typos. It's something you can do in advance to ensure that everything's right. And that's important for two reasons, not only because obviously you don't want those kinds of typos to exist, it's maybe not the end of the world, but it's a bit embarrassing, but for a second reason, and that is in all of our Tengyur texts that we translate, we always have 3 indexes. Because they're so intertextual, we always have, in addition to a general index, we always have an index of cited authors and cited texts. And if you didn't catch a particular typo, then that instance of Nagarjuna and Mula Madhyamaka Karakas would not appear in the index, because indexing is automated. So by catching all those typos, we ensure that our indexes are 100% accurate as well. And so that's one type of inconsistency. The other type would be more the kind that David was talking about, where a term is translated in different ways. And again, oftentimes that's appropriate. But if I'm reading through something and I see half the time I'm seeing, let's say, spirit of awakening, and half the time I'm seeing awakening spirit, and a third of the time, let's say, I'm seeing mind of awakening, I know as an editor that that's bodhicitta, and I might wonder if you really meant to translate it 3 different ways, and I would probably guess you didn't. If I saw you translate it 50 ways one way and 2 times the other way, I would probably just make an executive decision to change the 2 that were inconsistent. But if it was half and half or 30-30-30, at that point I would probably compile a list of these. This is what I usually do, compile a list of such inconsistencies and send you a spreadsheet and say, is this what you want, or is there one of these that you would prefer? And 9 times out of 10, the translator will be, oh, thank you very much. This translation has been in process for 5 years, 10 years. I used to translate it that way, but now I translate it this way. And those different variants appear all throughout the text. So that's a kind of catch. If you do that in advance, that, of course, saves a lot of time and saves the editor from guessing. This is also an argument in favor of using an editor who is a Buddhologist, who knows Buddhist theory and practice and knows some Sanskrit and Tibetan, because they're more likely to catch those things. An editor who was not a Buddhologist wouldn't necessarily know that those weren't perfectly appropriate terms. They wouldn't know those actually should be the same term. So somebody who knows Buddhist theory and practice and hopefully some of the languages is probably more likely to catch those things. The final thing you can do to help catch those things yourself in advance is create a glossary as you're going. So if your glossary, you have a trilingual glossary, English, Sanskrit, Tibetan, that glossary can catch those ranges of semantic meaning. So if you want to translate pramana 3 different ways, that'll be in your glossary. And then when I receive it as an editor and I see pramana, what I think is probably pramana, but it's showing up 8 different ways, I'll turn to your glossary and say, well, he or she really wanted 3, so then I might contact you and say, what should we do about this? But generally, that's what we're going to do as editors, look for those kinds of inconsistencies, not just take a heavy hand and change them without consulting you. But the less consultation we have to do, the more you've smoothed those things out in advance, the quicker the whole process goes. Those were my popcorn moments. My more sort of theoretical moments have to do with this issue of thinking of editing as integral to translation and transmission. And I think two of the big takeaways from the conference, there's quite a few, but one of them is the ways in which so many of the speakers have really eloquently broken down the distinction between translation and transmission. It's at least been very, very problematized, and perhaps so much smudge that it's almost difficult to distinguish a difference between those two. And I would want to add to that, perhaps, that the process of editing likewise can be problematized and maybe erase the distinction between translating and editing. They're really it's almost like a hyphenated idea. So again, to reiterate what I said earlier, what I would say the translation is, it's not just the text you've translated, it actually includes the entire published work. And I'll explain why I think that. So as I said before, I would argue all aspects and qualities of the work, as well as all parts of the work, affect how the translated work is understood, felt, and received. So to break down, whoops, I went backwards, sorry. To break down the first of those points, when I say all aspects and qualities affect these things, what do I mean? Aspects and qualities, first of all, aspects and qualities may depend on the intended audience, genre, etc. And by aspects and qualities of the work, I mean such things as style, which we've talked about to some extent, and tone. So what I'm suggesting here is that the exact same translation, if you change the style, either on your own as you're working through it or in consultation with an editor, that is a different translation. It's actually a different translation, and it affects also the way in which it's received and transmitted. It'll also affect how accessible it is and to whom. And probably most, or importantly, something many of us I think all of us have been discussing, is the readability. So the readability, which then connects with this notion of kindness that has been brought up, being kind to the reader, making a text more readable. And there's many ways in which you do that. And a lot of these things have to do with sort of style or of editing. For example, how many brackets are there, how many words are inserted in parentheses in Sanskrit and so forth. And how many capitalizations are there. The more of those kinds of things there are, the more stumbling blocks. Some people have referred to those as speed bumps. It sort of slows the reader down, makes them trip over it. It doesn't read smoothly and quickly. The more an editor removes those, whether it's you as an editor or a collaborator of yours or a publishing editor, the more you remove those, the more you make it readable. You're being kind to the reader. I put in the word love after that because I was very moved by the presentation this morning, that there really is, there's a love, as our speaker this morning mentioned, there can be a real love of the languages, love of the ideas, the material, and a love of the reader. And perhaps this even, dovetails with an idea that's come up since the beer conference of perhaps it's even a practice. I think it was discussed today also by Jose, that it's actually a practice of bodhicitta. It's a dharmic practice. It benefits yourself to think about how to make the text more accessible and readable. So to the extent that you've affected those things, you've changed the translation itself. Now that's sort of obvious. What's maybe less obvious is the other category, that the translation includes the entire published work in terms of the parts of the work. So what do I mean here? Well, the parts, again, what parts you include may be somewhat different depending on the intended audience and genre and so forth. And the parts of the work I'm thinking of are things like table of contents, preface, introduction. It's pretty obvious that the introduction is going to change. What I'm suggesting here is not only that the introduction is important, but it actually changed the translation. When you're involved in a translation, you spend a lot of time, a lot of years, reading multiple texts, commentaries, consulting with people. You have whatever text you're translating in your mind has been incredibly influenced by all these other factors. If you don't include that in your introduction, if you just sort of provide the raw translation, you're depriving your reader of that broader understanding of how you understood the translation. And in a way, it's sort of disingenuous, or at least it's not giving them the benefit of that fuller understanding. If the reader gets that fuller understanding by reading the introduction, and I'm going to say things like the footnotes and so forth, it's a different translation. So you take a book, a published book, you rip out the translation, you erase all the footnotes, and you say, well, that's the translation and everything else is apparatus. I'm arguing that's not the case. I'm arguing that the translation is all of that. It's the footnotes, the introduction, etc. All of that is what's received by the reader. Even chapter and section headings, again, it gives the reader an idea of how this work is structured. A sapche was a debate about the value of those. I find them very valuable. We usually put them in an appendix, but it shows how the Tibetan authors themselves saw how the work was structured. A well-organized table of contents, when the reader picks that up, browses the table of contents, you're giving them right away sort of here's the structure of the work. That's part of the translation. I would say it's not ancillary to the translation. annotations, footnotes, and endnotes, appendixes, tables, mini essays, outlines, etc. Glossaries, very important, as I was just mentioning. And then likewise, indexes are sort of like table of contents. So many of you may do this as well. When I pick up a book, first thing I'll often do is look at the table of contents, flip to the back, look at the index. The index, if it's well organized, not just a list of words, but well organized with subcategories, it shows you a lot about the themes that are in the book and also how they're subcategorized, and it shows you how the translator and editors thought about what themes are in here and how they're subcategorized. So a well-done index, likewise, does that. And as editors, we will always ask our translators to provide us with a list of terms that they think should be indexed and in what sort of subcategories, because it shows how they think about the structure of the translation. And likewise, bibliographies, you might think that's just sort of a thing you stick on at the end, but a bibliography tells you, a bibliography of 100 Western sources and 100 Tibetan and Sanskrit sources, if you look at that, it tells the reader, again, what has influenced this translation. So I would say that's not ancillary, it's actually part of the translation. Because if I look at a bibliography, I understand what you've read, and I understand how it's affected your thinking about the translation. So I would, again, say all of that is part of the translation. So in summary, to reiterate, I would say the translation includes the entire published work, all aspects, qualities, and parts. All right.
I have two more things that I forgot to say briefly about the introduction. Earlier today, Peter Roberts and I were talking about Gene Smith, and Peter said, oh, he wrote the best introductions. And I said, well, I'm talking about that later, so what do you remember? And he said they were the source of so much information. There was just so much really good, detailed information in his introductions about the author of the work and the list of the author's incarnations and just detailed information about the subject. And I wanted to just take that opportunity to mention that Curtis Schaefer has compiled these wonderful introductions into a new publication, Among Tibetan Texts.
Came out
Is that the
in
title?
2001, I think.
Oh, is it, oh, excuse me. It's not that new then. It's just new to me. So also Dr. Harding earlier this morning was talking about how can there be transmission in a book. And in thinking about front matter, particularly what you say in the introduction and the way you present the parts that you create yourself beyond just the translation, it seems to me that there's a lot of opportunity there to bring a tone of and mood of profound respect for the text, and also in the way that you present the history of the text and its origins and so on. You can really convey to the reader, in your words, the power and the spiritual gravitas and wisdom and sacredness of the work, the lineage, and so on.
Other comments among the four?
Well, I had one other thing I was going to present. What time does this end?
6:30.
6:30. Okay, but everyone's really tired.
Yeah.
I was just recalling, someone else brought this up about how at the last conference David Bellows said, don't make your reader feel inadequate. And that's another thing as editors that we help out with. You know, we look at the places where we feel inadequate and then we write a little query to the author or the translator. I'm like, I don't know what this means. And so one of them that came up recently, we're putting out a survey and collection of translations from Rich Solomon of the Gandharan Buddhist literature. And in one of those texts, you know, from the first century or whatever, was a commentary on sutra verses. And it came across this line here, and it says, the word wise means that he has arrived at knowledge connected with that of others by means of knowledge that is dependent on others. And I go, oh, you know, what does that mean? this is the kind of thing, there's a lot of Buddhist terms in there, and a lot of them look quite familiar, but then there's other things that come up, that sounds like something I've seen before, but I don't think I've seen that before. And so, I said, I queried, could you say some more about this? And so, and he came back, he says, I'm not really sure. These terms are unusual, apparently found only here. And I'm like, well, that's an interesting fact, I would want to know that as a reader. It's really helpful, I think, for the reader if you let them know when there's something in a translation that you don't understand. You don't just make your best guess and let people after you figure it out. I think it's really helpful to point out those places where there's a lacuna in knowledge. Maybe some people here actually know what it means, and I can take that back. I don't know. So we added a sentence to that effect to his introductory comments, So, yeah, just one more aspect of the editing process is paying attention to those places where you're confused.
And to that point, I mean, the editor is really your last line of defense before you're really exposed to the rest of the world. And so it's really, it's a teamwork. It's a communication, it's a negotiation process, just like any relationship, I guess. And it can be complex, and I would just encourage everyone to get to know your editor, talk to your editor as early as possible, and just realize that every step along the way it's a negotiation, that you actually are editors yourself with your own text. Half of your translation, most of your translation process is probably you editing your first draft. So there's a negotiation process there. There's a negotiation process when you're dealing with a team, when you're dealing with sponsors, when you're dealing with timelines. And then there's a negotiation process with your readership, being realistic about who's going to be interested in these works. And just keeping that in mind and realizing that no one's ever going to be 100% happy on either side, between the author and the editor. But we're all trying to work together and trying to have a shared vision. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. And yes, speaking to Tom's point as well about the value of knowing the context of your readership, knowing the world, especially in our situation, it's translations really. Having a sense a little bit of the language and the culture can really help in terms of knowing the constraints and knowing the variety and knowing what to pick up on. And I just would encourage also translating training programs to also think about including in the curriculum editorial methods as well. I think that would be really helpful. And then that helps, I think, encourage students as well to feel a bit more confident that they have something solid in training. So.
Well, we have some time for questions. We have do we have volunteers to take the, I'll jump down and around. Oh yeah, okay, Jeremy. Thanks.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to have so many experienced and expert editors together on the same panel and listen to the way your thought process is and all the negotiations that go, that take place. One question I have, and I'm going to take advantage of this particular, gathering of all the editors here, is really we, those of us who are working from Tibetan sources, we are aware of the problem of often the absence of the use of pronoun in Tibetan texts, and which, raises the problem of the voice. And whether we want to say one does this, one does that, one does this, which sort of puts brings a kind of an element of coldness. Mm-hmm. You do this, you do this, you do that, seems to be very prescriptive, because the author is now removed. We do this, we do this, we do this, which is more inclusive. So there, a Tibetan text could be, the voice could be either of those three, and need not necessarily be wrong. So this is a struggle. I'm sure I'm speaking for others, and maybe others don't have that problem, but I do have that problem, you know. And part of that is coming from the fact that my own natural language is Tibetan, and when I read Tibetan text, I don't need to have that problem. But when I read the English, produce the English, you know, this having to use a pronoun forces me to choose a voice. So I have sort of normally come up with my own solution, which is, if it is a philosophical text, I tend to go for one this, one that, one that. So it's more objective kind of. If it is a more prescriptive text, then I say, you do this, you do this, you do this, you do this. If it is a kind of a more reflective, inspiring, kind of talking about the problems of suffering and talking about the, you know, then I tend to use the we, because the author is also basically including. But I think this is my own kind of personal, eccentric kind of approach. But since you have edited a lot of these texts, I'm sure you must have thought about the problem of voice. So I would really love to hear from all of you how you handle this problem.
I myself, I think along very similar lines. I've actually never considered using we, never used we as either as a translator or as an editor, and I don't think I've ever received a translation for publication where we was there, unless, you know, Tibetan had an underlying we. But as a translator myself, I think along very, very similar lines about one being much more abstract and you being much more familiar, not necessarily prescriptive. Sometimes it's a very intimate and type of passage where a teacher is speaking to a student, for example. And I ran into that a lot in Tsongkhapa's Ngagam Chemo, where there were passages where there's no pronoun, and at some points, even within the same paragraph, he seems to be saying more abstractly, like, if one were to think this. I mean, sometimes it's more polemical, like, if you think this, you're wrong. But sometimes it's more like, well, if one were to think this, one would be wrong for the following reasons. Therefore, you should do this. And actually to switch from one to you in the same paragraph, at least that's how I'm reading how Tsongkhapa was thinking, more abstractly and then more personally. And I would do my own translation that way. As an editor, if I received a text in which the voice was consistently one throughout, I might have a conversation with the person and saying, do you want it? I'd say, this is how it's coming across to me. The tone sounds very, like you say, cold and abstract. Is that what you want? And I might try to persuade them to use you more often, or maybe change all instances to you. And if they resisted, I don't think it's such an absolute rule in our series that we would say you can't do that. But I would probably have a few discussions on topics like that. Likewise, if it was you throughout and it seemed appropriate to do one at times, I might have a conversation. So I'd have a conversation, give my opinion, and see what the translator thought. And if on that particular issue, I don't think as editors, we would be too hard and fast. But I at least want to bring it up, because again, I think tone is important, very, very important. And you want to be able to reach, the only other thing I'll say is I think it's important to think we think in terms of reaching multiple audiences. I don't think you have to think your translation can only reach scholars and therefore it won't be accessible to the public, or if I make it accessible to the public, I've dumbed it down so much that scholars will disregard it. I think you can hit a middle ground where scholars will feel very confident that all the philology and all the work has been done to produce a really accurate, beautiful translation. You can look up things in footnotes and in the back in appendices and so forth, but it also reads very smoothly for the lay reader or for the practitioner. So.
Yeah, I would mostly leave it to the translator's discretion. I think they have many more clues to know what's most appropriate, and as long as the tone sounds consistent, sounds clear, it makes sense in English, it's really, I would leave that mostly to the translator.
I mean, you do have to be careful when it switches back and forth randomly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's more what a copy editor is looking at, is if someone's just not paying attention and using it willy-nilly, you know, just whatever came to them at that moment. And so you have to kind of look at it to... we do a certain amount of changing ones to we's and you's, but you know, once you make a decision, then you have to stick by it. So it's you only do that you know, when you're really sure about it, because it creates more work for yourself.
Could I just ask if at the same time that you're answering this question, you could...
Embodied voice.
Raise your hand so we
Sorry,
see.
yeah.
Oh, here we are.
At the same time that you're answering this question, you could bring in gendered pronouns. What you do with plural, singular, gendered pronouns, to what extent it should be sort of mirroring, especially if you're looking at the Sanskrit, the actual gender in the Sanskrit, to what extent one is responding to important issues of identity.
Personally, I think that's a translation methodological issue, so I would normally leave that also to the translator's discretion. I don't know how you guys feel about that.
Be informed by this.
They have a whole page on this in the Chicago Manual, workarounds. But, because it's a translation, if the original text is clearly a he pronoun, then, you're at your risk. You change it, I think. I don't know. I mean, it depends on the text. It really, if the purpose of the text is really strictly pedagogical and you're really trying to reach an audience and convert them and can touch them, these are kinds of things that can really just sort of make people dismiss what you're saying. And so if you feel like you're authorized by history and your context, to speak this author as they would speak if they were living today, then, go back and forth or, change the sentence to edit it out, or there are many different workarounds.
Yeah, it's a difficult question. I think it was addressed earlier today by, was it Jose, about the possibility of changing to a plural, they, them, to erase the gender issue. Again, that's not something, I don't think we have at least not yet, an absolute policy we're going to enforce one way or the other, but we'd certainly have a conversation with the author about, if it seems really overly gendered, overly masculine, sort of off-putting to a wider audience, we would have a conversation. Is that how you want to keep it, or would you be open to changing this to the plural? In one text, the word yogin came up quite often. The yogin does this, the yogin does that. Conversation about, well, what about saying yogin, parentheses, long I, yogin, yogini? So yogin E, and that was a solution the author was happy with, so that's what we did. It's a little bit less awkward than he, she everywhere, he/he. Yogin E was a little bit less problematic. You can, I don't particularly like the changing the gender every other paragraph, but I try to avoid that. I think it's very confusing for the reader, although I've seen some publications make that choice. So one paragraph will be all masculine, the next paragraph will be all feminine. But I think that probably confuses the reader more than necessary. But it's a very important issue to address, for sure. And it would be wonderful if all publishers could, at some point, if some sort of standard way of addressing that came up, so it became standardized across publication enterprises. Maybe that'll occur sooner than later.
I mean, the new Chicago Manual is coming out in November, and brand new with this is
Would you like to hold it now?
Well, it's not the new one, but new with this edition will be permitting of the pronoun they to refer to individual people.
Oh, hi, I have a question. I'm here.
Yes.
So I was interested that you called, every aspect basically of the formatting part of the translation, and we're seeming really to differentiate published books from online media, PDFs, so forth. What about like Kindle or e-readers that change the formatting of the books? At least my old Kindle does. Mm-hmm. And how, we as, the generations coming up do more interface on their devices rather than with books.
Yeah.
There are ways. This is more of a production issue, in part than an editorial one. But there are ways of putting the coding on the files such that they convert better to electronic formats than others. It's outsourced. We don't do so much with that in-house.
We have an editor.
Maybe one of my colleagues here could speak better to it.
And we likewise have an editor that works with us, not outsourced, who handles that. It's a lot more technically difficult, but so it takes a lot more time and a lot more money. But I think it's essential because it's nothing, in my mind, worse than a Kindle edition where the locators, they change depending on what device you're on. There's no way for It's not just an academic scholarly thing, being able to cite page 42, line 7. It is that. That's very important for scholars to be able to cite something consistently that others can look up. But for lay people and practitioners as well, you know, you read something here, it refers to some other text, anybody might want to go look that up. And if it's a reference to a Kindle source that's changing, it's not useful. So I'm adamantly against that. We will, I think, never release a book. We're releasing ebooks, but they will never be books that don't have those hard page references embedded.
Mm-hmm.
Our older ebooks are definitely worse than our newer ones. The people are getting better at it in terms of improving that experience. So.
Is that your question? Did that?
I guess I was also asking, hello. More of like an existential question, sort of on the future of books or something like that.
My hope is that there will always be published books as well that are archived in libraries. They're more likely to last 400 years. There was an article in Time magazine, I forget how long ago, 15 years ago, about this very issue and about the fact that the Library of Congress and others in the U.S. government are like archiving everything physically, because even if you have something electronically on a disk, eventually older machines don't even read those disks and so forth. The software has changed. So I think it's absolutely essential to have hard copies of everything that, you know, at least those last 400 years, unless miraculously all copies in the world get burned or something. And then existentially, I would simply say, yes, reading an electronic text on an iPad or something, or on a computer screen, that is a different experience. I mean, we should think about the transmission there. But I don't think we're in charge of saying, you know, people can't do that. But it's important to be aware that what the transmission of the information is, it is felt differently, I think, when you read it in a book as opposed to on a screen. So that's a good question.
I was just reading an article, I think, from the New York Times. I don't know if anyone else saw it, that there's a trend that booksellers are noting that back to hard copy printed books.
So I have a much more technical question. It has to do with endnotes. There are a lot of ways of referring people to endnotes, and you know, in an academic book or scholarly book, you're going to be flipping back and forth a lot. And I have my own strong preferences about how I like to use it. I mean, I like to be able to get there and get back easily instead of having to look up 3 different things, like, you know, what chapter it is, and that also then has to do with the running heads. So I wonder if in your different operations you have a universal style that you're trying to apply there, or whether it varies. Or...
I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but
well,
I mean,
let me just try again, because it's actually I think it's a very simple question, really. So in other words, well, let me give 2 possible examples. One, so say you're looking something up, and the way that the endnotes are set up is that on the running head for the endnotes,
yeah,
it'll say notes to pages 241 to 248. I find that to be very helpful. Whereas if instead the endnotes are broken up and it just says chapter 1,
yeah,
and you've got to figure out which chapter you're in, and
yeah,
so on, that makes it much harder.
I think that's becoming more common, right? To have the running heads on the
yeah.
front.
Well, I mean, my default, I like just to have consecutive throughout the whole book. So each note has 1 number, and you know, you don't have to say, is this the first number 1 or the second number 1, or but you know, we get books that are, you know, that have distinct standalone chapters, or you have, you know, footnotes running into the 2000s, and so it's helpful in those cases. Yeah, definitely, you want running heads that are going to help the reader as much as possible.
And we've made a decision not to use endnotes. As a reader, again, being kind to the reader, I mean, it's a debate. You could say that footnotes, you know, really throw off the feeling, the absorbing of the text. But again, my argument and sense is that the footnotes are critical to your understanding of the text. And if they aren't, then they shouldn't be there. Or you should put it in an appendix or something. So the footnotes, if it's just sort of, you know, a quote and then here's the Dergay reference, that's not going to probably get in anyone's way. If it's an explanatory footnote that goes on for 2 or 3 lines, it's probably there for a good reason, and it should be there right on the page, a footnote, not as an endnote. Where that's more problematic is if you have an author who submits explanatory footnotes, but many, many of them, and they go on for sometimes, you know, many paragraphs. That then has to be dealt with and edited in some way to make it much more readable. We've only had one case recently, actually, the two chapters of the Kalachakra Tantra, 3 and 5, where the translators have done such scholarly work and looked up 4 different commentaries, and there's a lot of information that's really important, and both of those books have about 4,000 notes. And we opted in this case, it's not published yet, so we could change it yet, but as of now, in the galley form, we are using endnotes for that, but definitely sequential. It gets unwieldy. You have footnote, 3,942. So it takes up that much space on the page. But I think that's a little bit kinder to the reader because it's one shot as opposed to trying to figure out, like you said, where it is in the thing.
I slightly disagree. I think it depends on the content and your readership, whether you include footnotes or endnotes. And of course, it depends really. If you have, say, a canonical work like the Kalachakra Tantra or Sutra, and maybe some people will be using it as a aid to translation or reading it as a historical work and want to use it as an aid for research, and then the endnotes can be helpful, but perhaps footnotes would not be helpful to someone who could potentially use that text for their practice or for contemplatively just enjoying the work. So it kind of limits the readership, I feel like, depending on the content. I mean, of course, if it's an academic work, most academics prefer footnotes, but it really depends on the context.
Well, that's good. We have our first debate because I would
Footnotes and endnotes.
I would disagree with that only in the sense that I think even for the practitioner who again, to me it's a different translation. If a person reads what the verse is or what the prose passage is in a translation from the Kalachakra Tantra, and then that person is forced to kind of look down there and read it a footnote. Granted, that's an extra piece of work. But if that footnote is really informative and actually says something that would change that reader's understanding of that, even if they're a practitioner, I think that's important. It's part of the translation. Ideally, your translation itself, it accomplishes that. You don't even have to have the footnote. But as we know, it's quite often the case it's necessary. If it's a term that's an important term that's throughout the whole book that needs to be understood in a certain way, that goes in the introduction. But on a case-by-case basis, if a certain passage is, you have to sort of explain it somehow, otherwise it probably will be misunderstood in some way, then you have to have a footnote there for the sake of any reader. That would be my argument.
I feel that many non-academic readers just simply don't want to read, tiny little font like that, and with the philological details and that sort of thing. So, but it's just, I guess, depends on the context. So.
This is also along the lines of being kind to the reader and in terms of standardization. But how hard do you think it would be for editors of different presses or translators in general to agree on a single way of transcribing Tibetan names into English? Like, I think it would be very nice to have...
Repeat that, please.
Like, how difficult would it be to get everyone to agree on one, or at least a general guidelines for rendering Tibetan terms into English, like Tsongkhapa or Mipam, for instance? I know there's that phonetic rendering.
Yeah.
So the THL has, David Germano and Nicholas Tanadra, a linguist, have come up with the general guidelines for phonetic renderings of Tibetan terms, but I think that would be...
we could sit down and do it right today, I think.
Yeah,
All together, right? Do it right now.
Now we just have to get the Tibetan government to come into the meeting with us.
Well, there is a start already on the THL guidelines. I know there's certain
we have
cases,
guidelines too. I mean, everyone has guidelines.
But if we could agree on one guideline general, I know there's some cases where
the Treasury of Lives, you got a set of guidelines too.
But Amdo, if there's like an Amdo author, Payata Shah, or Nangchen Payata Sa, something like that, Payata Cha in Central, maybe there's certain cases where you could render like Chamba, Samba, Shamba, depending on your context. But just general guidelines, I think would be very, very helpful.
It would be supremely helpful.
if people could agree on them.
It's not just a question of publishers. It's the community of translators agreeing. Is it Jakpa or DRAG or DRAK, and how do you hear it?
Yeah, we actually.
But
Jimpa came to us with the Library of Tibetan Classics. We already had a style, but he didn't like it, so we had to change it.
What's super important, of course, is that within the context of a work, or ideally a series, it's consistent across the series. Definitely no Wiley in the body of the text. And you have a table in the back that says, here's the phonetic and here's the Wiley. So if it's unclear for anybody, they can look up the Wiley in the back. But throughout an entire book, and ideally throughout an entire series within a particular publication, you try to standardize it.
That's obviously a question that's going to go on forever, so I'm going to... I was going to suggest that we stop, and thank you, the four of you. A fantastic conversation about editing and publishing process.